Alaska has always felt so far away, the kind of destination that I'd save for when I could spend several weeks or maybe even months exploring. But living in Seattle, I realized that it's just a 2-hour flight to Juneau. So I stopped putting it off and went to get a taste of this wild place. I still want to do that epic multi-month Alaska adventure one of these years, but this short trip gave me an incredible taste of what this massive state has to offer. On my first full day of the trip, I booked a boat tour down to Tracy Arm, a long fjord with glaciers and icebergs at the end, massive towering cliffs, and a decent chance of seeing some classic Alaskan wildlife. It was so cold, I think it was in the 40s all day, just a little bit above freezing, plus rain and wind, and it was almost June, but it definitely didn't feel like it. Boat tours like this are definitely not a cheap way to travel, but for a place like Juneau that's so defined by the water, I mean, it's surrounded by water, you can't get there by road, you can only get there by boat or plane. It's not an island, but in some ways it kind of feels like it. And these boat tours, especially like this one, that are an all-day boat tour, you get to see a view of the water, you get to see epic landscapes, pretty good chance of seeing wildlife, glaciers, icebergs. Like, you really get pretty good bang for your buck. It's, again, not cheap at all, but I think that it's worth it if you can swing it. Before getting to the Tracy Arm Fjord, we lucked out and were suddenly surrounded by more than a dozen orcas. Apparently it's pretty uncommon to see orcas up in this part of Alaska. The naturalist on the boat said that they see them about 10% of the time on these tours. So pretty amazing to get to see so many of them. And they were really active. They were breaching. Some of them were spy hopping, which is when they do this and just stick their head out of the water and try to see further this way. But yeah, pretty amazing. Even though I get to see orcas in Seattle pretty frequently, it definitely doesn't get old. And the landscape that they were in helped make for some pretty epic photos. Shortly after entering into the Tracy Arm area, we saw some little black dots on the side of the cliffs. And when we got closer, you could tell that they were bears. There was a mom black bear and her 3 little cubs. 2 of them were more of like a cinnamon color, but they're all black bears. There are also grizzly bears in the area, but I think in this part of the Juneau area, black bears are much more common. Super cool to see. I've only seen bears a handful of times in my life, and to be able to see them from the water in a fjord like this with 3 little baby cubs, it was pretty incredible. So these sheer cliffs were all caused by glacier activity. There's an enormous ice field on the mountains above Juneau, and it flows out into glaciers at a bunch of different spots. And the glacier used to go all the way to the end of the Tracy Arm Fjord. It's something like 20 or 30 miles long. And it's just retreated over the last 100 or so years. And now it's just left this enormous fjord with towering cliffs. So the ice field comes down to a few different glaciers, one of which still reaches the water, and that's what's causing all of these icebergs. That was too frozen, too blocked up by ice for us to be able to get close to this time of year, but we could definitely see all the icebergs that flowed out from it. It was really fun and also pretty challenging to photograph them from the moving boat. I had my long wildlife lens on, the 100 to 400, and so I was able to zoom in really tightly, but because the boat was moving, it was hard to line up a nice composition, and I had to work really quickly and just kind of hope that I nailed focus and got a good enough composition. I'm happy that I got a few shots that are not too bad. I think if I was on a small boat where we could stop and really take our time with these icebergs, I probably would have gotten more detailed shots, but I was able to take enough that I got a few that I like. In a place this beautiful, I don't think it's that hard to get pretty good photos, especially if you're going with like the safe, classic compositions. But I think that in order to really make travel photography that stands out, it makes sense to find some space to get a little creative and just mess around and see what else you can come up with. One of the ways that I like to do that is to sometimes mix up genres of photography. So like in this case, some of the shots, I was taking more of a street photography approach, even though I was pretty far from any street. Maybe not the kind of photos that a lot of people would take in this area, but I think for travel photography, as opposed to landscape or just more pure nature photography, it can work well to have people in the photos to help show the scale of the place, to show people interacting with the place. And I think it just helps tell a more well-rounded story of what it's like to visit Juneau, Alaska. Even without the icebergs and the glacier and the wildlife and the huge mountains, this would have been a really cool tour just for the fjord walls themselves. It was so dramatic. It felt like I was somewhere in Norway, or like you put Yosemite Valley right up along the Alaskan coast. It was just incredible and hard to portray how massive those cliff walls were. So on the way back, we saw a little more wildlife. These are stellar sea lions, and then we saw a few humpback whales as well. Most of them were a little bit too far from the boat to really get a good view, let alone a good photo. But we saw a couple that were sort of close enough to where we could see them, and one of them breached not too far away from the boat, and I was able to get one or two pretty nice shots there. I didn't have time to also get video footage of them before we left, but don't worry, there's going to be a lot more humpback whale footage in the coming days. So sort of randomly that day, I got about $50 on my Venmo account that I had completely forgotten about, but apparently there was a class action lawsuit against Cliff Bar. I don't even remember why. I think maybe they claimed that they were healthy and the jury decided that they weren't or something like that. But I had ordered a bunch of Cliff Bars during COVID, and so I got an email from Amazon saying that you're eligible for this class action lawsuit. So randomly enough, I just got $50. And so because of that, I decided I was going to use that to splurge on a nicer dinner than I normally would do. Usually on these photo trips, the photography comes first. I'm traveling sort of frugally, and I'm just not prioritizing interesting, expensive, fancy food. But while I was in Alaska, I wanted to try the halibut fish and chips that I had heard about. These were at a pretty nice restaurant bar kind of place right on the water with pretty epic views. Something like $50 for fish and chips, which is just insane and not something I would normally do. But they were pretty good, and the view is pretty incredible as well. So on the second day, I woke up just absolutely wiped, being on a boat for an entire day and on my feet the whole time. That part was my fault, but I just couldn't stop taking pictures and running around from one side of the boat to the other. But I was pretty exhausted, and so I slept in and then got breakfast, got coffee, and then just decided to go for a walk around town. It's pretty wild that Juneau is actually a capital city. I mean, there's not a lot of people in Alaska in general, but Juneau only has something like 30,000 residents that live there full time. It's a really small town, and it doesn't really feel like a capital city, at least to me, in a lot of ways. But also when you're on the Main Street area, it doesn't feel like there's only 30,000 people there, because there's not. With the cruise ships in town starting in May and kind of going throughout the summer and into fall, There's a lot of people from each of these cruise ships. Most days there's 3 or 4 cruise ships in town, and that leads to a lot of people walking around a pretty small Main Street area. But if you just go a couple blocks away from the main shops and jewelry stores and restaurants down there, you pretty much lose all the tourists, and you get to see a small slice of what life in Juneau, or at least this part of Juneau, is actually like. I've never really had much interest in doing a cruise, but I'm like slightly, somewhat morbidly interested in just trying one, just from an almost anthropological perspective, just to see what it's like and see what this aspect of travel is like that I've never done and never really had a lot of interest in. I probably won't do that. It's a sort of an expensive experiment. But if I were to take a cruise, it would definitely be to a place like Alaska. But it was fun to walk around this part of the town. The weather kind of went in and out. There were passing rainstorms. The sun came out a couple times. I found these yellow and red houses by this white picket fence and this nice photogenic tree, and I thought it made for a nice scene. I'm still not sure whether I like the vertical or the horizontal shot between these two, but if you want, you can let me know in the comments which ones you like better. I think I'm leaning towards the vertical one. And then walking to the edge of town, which is not very far away from the middle of town because it's a tiny area, I ended up stumbling upon this little hiking trail. It was mostly flat. I mean, hiking trail is sort of a misnomer, more just a walk in the woods, but it definitely felt like I was entering the wilderness. There's bears that walk into town sometimes, and you're just right up against huge mountains and glaciers and forest that goes on for a long time. I mentioned earlier that there aren't any roads that go into Juneau, so in some ways it feels like an island, but instead of being surrounded on all sides by water, it's surrounded mostly by water and then by glaciers and forest and just absolute massive tracts of wilderness. In any case, it was pretty cool to be able to just walk away from my hotel downtown and quickly be in this wild of a trail and get to see a wilder side of Juneau without having to get in the car or take a tour or something. So when I booked the Tracy Fjord tour that I did on the previous day, I knew that there was a chance that we would see some wildlife, but I didn't expect to end up seeing 4 bears and something like 20 whales and sea lions and a bunch of birds and just as much wildlife as we did. And so I had also booked 2 dedicated whale watching trips on top of that. So this was the first one. And it was a pretty different experience from the Tracy tour. Instead of being a big boat with 70 or 80 people on it, this one was a small boat that I think can fit 6 passengers, but there's only 3 or 4 of us that day, I think 4. And we saw something like 6 humpbacks, I think. It was pretty incredible. And I've seen whales before. I've done a bunch of whale watching trips, but the backgrounds for these photos were just incredible. I mean, there's these huge glaciated mountains that just go right under the water, and then you've got humpbacks in the foreground. That's a recipe for making some good photos. And there are so many humpbacks in this area that you're pretty much guaranteed to see them. The captain on this trip said that he's been doing this for a while. He's done something like 1,500 whale tours, and he's never not seen a whale here, which is pretty incredible. So if you want to see humpback whales, this is definitely one of the best places in the world to do it. The next day I went out for my second dedicated whale watching tour with the same company on the same kind of small boat, and we immediately saw a calf humpback breaching, and it just breached something like 30 times in a row, just over and over and over again. It kept breaching, but we had to move on and leave it alone and go find other whales to see. It was one of the coolest things that I've seen in my whole life. I've seen whales breach a couple times, but they've usually been pretty far from the boat or from the shore, and they usually just do it once or twice before they stop. On top of that first humpback, I think we saw 6 or 7 others as well. So really, across the 3 days of boat tours, I think I probably saw, 20 plus 6, probably like between 30 and 35 whales, which is just insane. Maybe some of them were the same whale that I saw multiple times, but even so, just absolutely incredible. I've done, I think, 7 or 8 whale watching trips in my life in the US and Canada, and they've all been really different from each other, even when it's the same company back to back, like on these 2 days. It's just, there's always different whales, the landscapes are different, the light's different, the background is different. It's just one of my absolute favorite things in the world to experience, and it tends to lead to some pretty epic photos. After that whale trip, I had lunch, backed up some photos and video footage, and then I took the city bus back to the Juneau airport to get a rental car for the last 24 hours of my trip. You definitely don't need a car for a trip to Juneau, especially if you're doing tours and staying downtown as opposed to out in the valley. But I felt a little trapped not being able to just explore on my own. And a car for the day was only going to be something like $90. Little expensive, but a tour bus tour to the Mendenhall Glacier that I wanted to do was going to be $60 or $70 anyway. And so it was kind of a no-brainer because I would be able to do that with the rental car instead. So first I went for a drive over on Douglas Island, which is just across the channel from Juneau. I think it's still technically in Juneau. But anyway, I saw a trail on Google Maps on the other side of Douglas Island called the Rainforest Trail. It looked like it was only a mile or so, but anything called Rainforest Trail is worth checking out in my book. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, except for the occasional boat that went by and the occasional float plane that went overhead. There just wasn't much else happening out here. Again, Juneau's not an island, but it kind of feels like it. And it definitely feels like you're at the edge of the world. It was incredibly peaceful down there by the water. There were a couple other people further down the beach, but I mostly had the whole place to myself. Knowing how many whales there were in the area, I figured if I waited around long enough, maybe I'd get a chance to see one again. And sure enough, I saw a humpback blow out in the distance, and I was able to watch it slowly swim by for a while before I headed back into town for the evening. And then driving back into Juneau, you get a good glimpse of the Mendenhall Glacier, which sits right above town. And I was able to get this photo that I really like that shows this view and shows a huge Alaska Airlines plane in the front of it, which just helps give perspective of how massive that glacier is. On the final day of the trip, I started with a drive out to the Mendenhall Glacier. This is one of the most popular spots for tourists to visit. A lot of cruise ship passengers take a day trip out to here. I got there pretty early, so it wasn't too crowded, but there were already some tour buses that had shown up. And there's a few different hikes that you can do there. I did the most popular one, which is out to this waterfall. You also get glimpses of the glacier in the distance along the way, but honestly the best view of the glacier, at least without having to kayak out onto the lake, is from the visitor center. I got lunch at a place that felt like old school Juneau, Alaska. This was the kind of place where 100% sure no one changed their habits at all during COVID. The old waitress in there called me sugar and seemed a little surprised that I didn't want to drink alcohol at 11:15 in the morning. If you've ever seen the show Northern Exposure, it's kind of like that. Before going back to the airport and returning the car, I went what's called out the road, which is out the one and only road that leaves town from Juneau, and it dead ends not too far north of town, but it was pretty cool just to be able to go for a wander and stop off at random beaches and little trails and just see what I could find. It felt very much like the Pacific Northwest that I'm used to, but with even more impressive mountains in the distance. There were lots of people out exploring, a few birds that I hadn't seen before, so it definitely felt like I was somewhere new, but definitely also still felt like the Pacific Northwest. I basically just wandered around and soaked in as much Alaska as I could before heading back to the airport. Turned into a bit of an impromptu birding afternoon. I think I added a few more birds to my life list. It was a really good way to end the trip. I'd like to thank my Patreon members for supporting the channel. Their contributions help make these trips possible. Over there, we regularly talk about editing, gear, and the business of travel photography. I share bonus photos and monthly updates talking about what I've been up to and what's coming up next. I recently ditched Instagram, and I talk about why over on Patreon, but I have a free monthly email newsletter where I share new photos from a recent trip each month. If you'd like to join either or both of those, there are links in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next month.